What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we're going to be building out a crypto tracker app. So in recent news, since Dogecoin has been on an absolute rocket ship to the moon apparently, and since Bitcoin is all the rage, I figured we'd make an app that, brings cryptocurrency onto this channel. So we'll take a look at how to, set up an API, view models, MVVM, this custom cell here. We'll also take a look at downloading the image, no libraries. We'll talk about caching. So here we scroll down, these images load in, but if we scroll back up, they're all cached. So yeah, we'll build out this pretty awesome app. So if that sounds good, make sure you start by absolutely destroying the like button down below. Helps out so much more than you guys can imagine. Hit subscribe if you're into iOS and haven't done so already. That all said, let's get into making this app. Alright, let's get started by opening up Xcode and creating a new project. We're going to stick with the app template under iOS. Let's go ahead and give this project a name of CryptoTrack. You want to make sure your language is set to Swift, Lifecycle UI Kit, and interface is Storyboard. Go ahead and save the project wherever you'd like. And first things first, we're going to expand our window, close this right panel, and jump into our view controller. So just to talk about a little bit of the high level of what we need to accomplish, and we'll actually write out some comments here. Let me bump up the font size. We're going to want to have a class which is responsible for calling the API that we'll talk about in a second. We'll probably also want some UI to show different cryptos basically and their prices. We probably also want a proper MVVM pattern. So let's talk about each of these one by one and we'll build it out. So first and foremost, API, where are we getting our data from? So there is actually this website called coinapi.io and they've got a free crypto API. And you can go there and create a free account to get an API key to follow along. So we're going to be using this today. They've got a bunch of different endpoints. I'm not going to go through all of them since there's way too many, but I already have a API key and a mock response here. So what we'll go ahead and do here is we're going to go ahead and create a new file, and I'm going to create an object which is going to be responsible for calling the API. So we're going to go ahead and call this API caller.swift, and we're going to create this as a final class with a shared instance. So we can say shared is going to be an instance of API caller. We're going to go ahead and privatize the initializer. We're going to also want to have, some constants in here. So I'll just create a private constant struct, and then I'll also create one constant in here, which is going to be our API key. Now, once we have this, if we think about this broadly, what do we actually need to do? So we want to be able to, fetch a list of different cryptocurrencies and their related information. So I'm going to create a function. Maybe we'll put it below a comment. We'll say public here. We're going to say public func, and I'm going to go ahead and say get all crypto data, which is pretty simple, and it's going to have a completion handler. And this completion handler, this function should go make a API call, and the completion handler should give us a result back. In this success case, we're going to have an array of crypto objects. We'll just put a string there for a quick second while we write the rest of this out. And then we're also going to want this whole closure to go ahead and return void. So now that we've got this defined, we want to actually implement it. So let's go back to our browser here, and we can see that I've already got an API key in the URL here. So we can go ahead and just copy this. I'm just going to copy it and drop it into my API key here. Looking pretty good. And now what we want to go ahead and do is actually make an API call to this endpoint, which is going to give us a list of a bunch of information back. Now, if we take a look at the response, we have things like asset ID, we've got a name, we've got a bunch of other information, but we also have this ID for an icon, which we'll talk about in a moment. But what we can actually do is let's copy everything here up to assets, and I'll go ahead and just copy that, and back over here in our code we need to write out a API key. So what I'll do is create the endpoint as a static as well as a constant. So I'll go ahead and say assets endpoint is going to be a URL optional, since URL's constructor does in fact return optional. And we can go ahead and do that. Now actually, instead of doing this, now that I think about it, what we'll actually do is we'll just hold on to it as a string, since we are going to want to append on our API key before using it. So now down below we can say guardlet URL will be a URL with a string, and we're going to take the assets endpoints, we're going to add a question mark, and then we're going to say the API key is going to equal, and then we'll go ahead and say constants.API key. We want to make sure we have an else block since we're unwrapping it because it's a optional constructor. And now we can go ahead and perform a API call here. It'll be a get request. We're going to say URL session shared, and we can just say data task with a URL, as well as a completion handler for data, response, and a error. And in our actual closure here, we'll go ahead and unwrap our response data here. We'll validate that the error is in fact nil. And now we want to convert our data into some type of object. So we'll need to use Codeable, but we'll need to first and foremost kick off this network call. So we'll say task.resume, and then in here we can say completion. In the catch block, it's going to be a failure. We'll hand back the error. And in here, we want to, decode the response. Now, before we go any further, let's talk a little bit about, let's ignore these errors. Well, let's talk a little bit about once we have, this API call working, how do we want to display it in our UI? So we're going to want to presumably have a table view in this app today, since it's fairly straightforward to set up. So we'll go ahead and create a table view in here. And what we'll want to do is have a custom cell, because we're going to want to show not only things like the cryptocurrency name, like Bitcoin, for example, but we also want to show, its price, its symbol, maybe its icon image. So after we create this table view here with a frame of 0 and a style of grouped, just for aesthetic purposes, we're going to want to create a custom cell that will register here as well. So before we do that registration function, let's go ahead and create a new file here. It's going to be a Cocoa Touch class. We're going to subclass the UI table view cell class, and I'm going to go ahead and call this a crypto table view cell. Make sure your checkbox here is not checked. We'll do it programmatically, and your language is set to Swift. Once it's created, go ahead and delete all of the stuff in there. And the first thing we're going to start off by doing is creating a identifier property, which will be a string of the same name as the class. Now back in our view controller, we can actually use this new cell. We can say register the crypto table view cell.self for that cell.identifier. Just like that. And now we want to go ahead and do a couple things in view.load. First and foremost, we're going to add this table as a subview, and we want to hook up its data source as well as its delegate to be self. We also want a title here, and we'll maybe go ahead and call it crypto tracker. Now you'll see errors pop up on this delegate data source line because we need to conform to the respective protocols, the delegate, as well as the data source. And now we also need to give our table view a frame. So we'll say view did layout subviews, super view did layout subviews. Since we're overriding it, we always need to call the superclass. We'll give the table view a frame of view.bound, so it takes up the entirety of the view. And then we'll want some table view functions. So we're going to say number of rows. We're going to default it to 0 for the time being. We're going to run the app in a moment so we can actually see, how far we've gotten. But we'll also need cell for row at index, in which we can go ahead and dequeue our cell. So we'll say, go ahead and try to dequeue a reusable cell. The identifier here will be our crypto table view cell.identifier. For index path. We want to make sure we cast it as our proper identifier here, a proper cell I should say. And we're going to go ahead and do an else block here because we'll convert this to a guard to bind it, and then we'll go ahead and return cell. Now I'm also going to go ahead and just set some dummy data on the text label here so we can actually see our cells show up, and maybe we'll turn this to 10. So that all said and done, let's go ahead and actually give this a run in one of our simulators so we can actually see, hopefully, our table view. So go ahead and pick a simulator of your choice, hit Command B to build and Command R to give it a run, and let's see if we're seeing a table view here. And if we're seeing the table view, we'll start to actually use our API, make sure we're getting some data back, and we'll also introduce some models and view models. So bear with my simulator here. Hopefully it is loading. Awesome, there it is. So we have our actual table view with our dummy cells. Looking pretty good. One thing that I want to improve here, aesthetically, we probably want a nice title at the top here. So we could do that programmatically, but it's a little easier just to do it in the storyboard for sake of time. So what I'll go ahead and do in here is we're going to select this controller. We're going to come up to the toolbar and hit Editor. We're going to hit Embed in a Navigation Controller. And we can go ahead and change this navigation bar style in the Attributes Inspector to a large title. And if you go ahead and give it a run once more, you'll notice now that we should see a title at the top just like that. Now you might be wondering, where is that title coming from? If you recall, we had set it back in View Did Load as Crypto Tracker. Awesome, looking pretty good. So now the next thing that we want to actually do is we want to go ahead and start using our API caller to actually get models out. Now before we do that, we should probably define some models. So we can go ahead and do it in a separate file. I'm going to create a new file and it's going to be called API models maybe, or just models. Swift file we'll define here, and let's go ahead and call it models, and we're going to want two models in here. If we come back to the browser, we'll take a look that in our actual response from this API call, we get an array notated by the first bracket of objects. So we're going to want a API response object, and then we're going to also want a model that represents each of these entries. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first one, like I said, will be a API response. It's going to be codable and it's going to have an array of other objects. So what we can go ahead and do is we could actually create it in here, or actually we can even be smarter about it. If I just go ahead and paste in that object, we can create a single object in here. We can go ahead and call this a crypto object. It's going to be of type codable. Let's bring in some of the attributes on here, some of the properties. So we're going to have a asset ID. We're going to care about the name. Now you don't have to bring in all of these. You know, it's a little subjective in terms of what you want. We probably want the price in USD, and it looks like it's in the form of a float. So we'll go ahead and do that, and maybe we'll also grab the ID icon. It's up to you how much stuff you want to grab, but I'll leave it at that for the sake of brevity here. But now that we've got this stuff in, what we can actually do back in our API caller is we want to convert our response data into this type of object. So we'll go ahead and say, let's cryptos, plural, is going to be JSON decoder. Go ahead and try to decode an array of crypto objects from the data. Now you want to make sure you prefix this with a try. And what we'll also go ahead and do is we're going to change the result up here in the success case to hand us back an array of crypto objects. And assuming this was successful, we can go ahead and just say success and pass in that cryptos array. And just like that, it'll actually get rid of the warnings there for us, as well as hopefully be working. So let's go ahead and hit Command B. All those warnings went away. And now let's actually try to call this API from our view controller. So back in our view controller, in the viewDidLoad function, we're going to say API caller shared, and I'm going to go ahead and say get all crypto data. This is going to hand us back a result. Now in this result, we can go ahead and switch. And in the success case, we should have our models. So we'll print out maybe models.count to make sure we're actually getting something. And in this case, we'll get an error, and we'll also print out the error in this case in case something occurs that is unexpected. We'll know and we'll see it in the output. So go ahead and give this a run, and let's see if we're actually getting some models back. So I'm going to expand this, and let's see. It looks like we have an error here. So it's saying price USD. We're getting nil back. So price USD string value. It looks like we're probably not, we don't have a key with string value for for the particular price for one of the entries. So what we want to probably go and do, let's take a look. So in here, we could probably go ahead and make this optional. Let's go ahead and give that a run once more. So what's basically happening there is the API is saying I was unable to find a price. Let's see what else is going on. So it looks like ID icon doesn't appear in every single entry as well. So I'll make that optional as well. Let's go ahead and give it a run once more. Now, all we expect to see is a number out. Looks like we have more errors. So let's see what the heck is going on. All right, so name, it looks like in some cases is either a integer or a string. So we'll go ahead and make this optional as well. I would assume asset ID is always a string, so we'll leave that as such. And let's go ahead and take a look. All right, awesome. So we're getting 11,823 entries back from our API. So we're going to have a ton of stuff here. So what we now need to do is we want to convert our, so actually before we even talk about the view model, we want to have a custom cell. So we already created this cell subclass, but if we think about this a little more broadly, what do we actually want to show in here? Let's add some comments. We want to show the name of the cryptocurrency. We also want to show its symbol that it trades under, and we potentially want to also show its price. All three of those pieces of information are fairly important, so that's what we want to do. Now, how do we want to lay them out? So presumably we want the name to be, the primary label. Maybe underneath it, we'll have a subtitle, lighter label for the symbol, and then we'll have the price all the way on the right-hand side over here. So let's actually go ahead and create a view model object that's going to actually encapsulate that information. So common naming convention, take the name of the view and suffix it with view model. We're going to want a name on here. We're going to want a symbol as well, which will be a string, and then we're also going to want a particular way to show the price. So what I can do is I can say price is going to be a string. If you kept in mind, the price that we get in our model is actually a float. So we're going to need to do some formatting via a number formatter to properly show it. So now that we've got this here, let's build out some of our cell. So we're going to want some sub views. We'll want the initializer here. We'll want to lay out our views, and then we'll also want to have a way to configure our actual cell with the view model. So I'll go ahead and say configure with view model. Now this is going to be a single view model, just like that. So let's go ahead and do the rest of this stuff. So let's do the initializer first. So we'll want init with a style. We'll want to say super init with said style and the same reuse identifier. We'll also want the required initializer, just like that. We'll want to override layout sub views since we want to give a layout and a frame to all of our sub views. And we'll also create those sub views. So we'll go ahead and say we have a name label. And we'll go ahead and do it as an anonymous closure here, like we usually do on this channel. So we'll go ahead and do that. Now I'm not going to customize it too much. The only thing I'll go ahead and do here is maybe just set a font size to be a little bolder and larger. So we'll say maybe size 20 and a weight of medium. I'll go ahead and copy and paste this a total of 2 more times for our other labels. This one here will be the symbol label. The font, I'll go ahead and make this maybe 16 or maybe even like 17, except this will now be perhaps a light color. You can even do regular, it's up to you. Now the next one here is going to be a price label. And this one here, I'm going to go ahead and say that it is going to be semi-bold, and we'll also keep 20 here. Maybe we'll also give it a different background color. So we'll say label dot, or text color I should say, is going to be system green. We'll see how that looks. Now we want to make sure we add these as sub views. So I'll go ahead and add that and 2 more here. Symbol label and a price label, looking pretty good. We want to lay all of these guys out, but before we do that, let's go ahead and assign their text. So we'll say name label text is view model, and you guessed it, .name. We can say price label text is view model.price, and finally symbol label text is going to be view model.symbol label. Now in our layout, so what do we first need to do? Well, we first want to say size to fit on all of these labels, because that'll self-size the labels to fit the text inside of it. So that's the price one, and let's also do the symbol label. Now we want to lay these out such that everything is relative to the container size. So the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is do the name label. So its frame is going to be cgrect. The X will go ahead and say is 5, the Y is 0. The width I'll say is the content views frames width divided by 2. And the height will be the content views frames height divided by 2. Now, what we want to basically do is we want this name label to sit above the symbol label. So the only thing that'll change for the symbol label is the Y position. So I can copy and paste it, change this to symbol label, and we can change the Y to be content view frame size height divided by 2, so it pushes it down 50%. And finally, we want the price label, and the price label will be the right half of the particular cell. So I'm going to go ahead and say it is content view frame size width divided by 2. The Y will be 0. The height here will just be the entire content view height. And the width here will be half the width dividing, or rather subtracting 5 from this half width, because we want it to have a 5-point buffer from the right-hand side. So now that we've got all this jazz here, what we want to now go ahead and do back in our controller is convert our models to our view models. So this is where we're getting our models. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is we are going to create an array. It's going to be a mutable array on the controller of view models. It's going to be our crypto table view cell view model, just like that. It's going to be initialized as an empty array initially. Now what we want to do in here is we're going to capture weak self. We're going to want to say self.viewModels is going to be viewModels.compactMap. And what we can go ahead and here and do is basically create one of those view models from each of the models. So this should be fairly straightforward. We're going to say $0.name. We'll coalesce it to a default value of maybe not applicable. The symbol here will be $0.assetID. And finally, the price needs to be a string. So this one's tricky. So let's just go ahead and say $1 for a second. And we're going to come back to this. We're going to put a comment here to use a number formatter. And let's see, now that we've got that there, what do we need to do? So the number of rows in our table view should be viewModel.count. And instead of assigning a dummy string there, we're going to say configure with a particular view model at the given position. And after we've created these view models, we want to make sure we don't forget to tell our table view to refresh itself. So on the main thread, we can say table view, go ahead and reload your data. So let's go ahead and give this a run. Let's see how we're doing. So we're going to call our API, and boom, we get a fairly long list of our information here. So looking pretty good, but there are a couple problems, obviously. First and foremost, everything is laid out a little weird. This text should be right aligned, not to the left, because the container of the label for the price starts here. All of this stuff is a little cramped, so let's fix up our layout. So the first thing we're going to say is height for row at index path. I'm going to hard code this to be 70. If we go ahead and give that a run, you'll see that everything is a bit taller now. We probably want our stuff on the left here to be, further into the right. It's a little too close to the edges of the screen. So let's go to our cell and let's fix up some of this. All right, so our price label here, we're going to go ahead and say its text alignment is going to be right. And let's fix up our layout here. So we've gone ahead and said that the X is 10, or rather 5. Let's go ahead and make that maybe 15, and we'll see what that looks like. So there's 15 right there, and then we'll also subtract 15 from the right of the price label. And we might want to bump up the font size here as well. So let's take a look at that. Looking pretty good. I still don't like how far to the left the text is. A lot of empty space. So what we can possibly even do here is bump up the font size even more. So in this case, we'll say 24, we'll say 20, and maybe for the price, we'll say 22. And now let's also increase this to be 25 from the right. Same thing here. And let's see, let's go ahead and run that and let's see what that looks like. Worst case scenario, we'll increase the height of our cell once more. All right, that's looking better. Okay, so I'm fairly content with how this is looking. It's not, too small, and we want our price to actually reflect the current price that it's trading at. So let's jump into our view controller again, where we created our view model. And instead of hard coding this to be $1 here, we have the price as a float. So I'm going to say the price here is going to be $0.price, and this is a float optional, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a default value of 0. The next thing we're going to want to do is create a number formatter. Now, what we want to actually do is create that number formatter globally so we don't have to create it over and over. So I'll go ahead and create a number formatter, and a number formatter allows you, as the name implies, to format numbers for various types of usages. So we can go ahead and say formatter here is going to be a number formatter. Now this formatter dot locale will be current. The formatter dot, let's see what else we have on here. Now we want this to be a currency type of format, and we can say if it allows floating points. Now if you take a look at the type of this, you can see it's a Boolean. We'll say true, and we'll also go ahead and say formatter dot. We want a format behavior, and if we take a look here, we can use just defaults. Now let's go ahead and let's see how we can actually go about passing in the type that we want on here. I believe there is a property, so if we go ahead and say we can go ahead and supply a currency code, we can supply a symbol ourselves, but the thing that we're actually looking for is a way to format this to currency by default. So there is a type on here somewhere. So let's see, there's going to be a decimal separator, there's a formatter with behavior, there's quite a few things in here. So let's go through this and let's go ahead and find it. All right, there is a minimum, minus sign. So there's quite a few things you can do on here if you're not familiar with the particular style. So there's a number style on here, and I believe that's what we're looking for. So let's go ahead and see if that is correct. So number style is number formatter dot style. So we can say number formatter dot style. Let's try that one more time. That's a CF number formatter. We just want number formatter dot style. And I'm going to click into this since autocomplete's giving me a rough time right now. And you can see there's quite a few. There's decimal, currency, percentage, scientific. So obviously we want currency today. So we can just type it in like that and get rid of this prefix since now Swift will do its job and infer it. And finally, we can return the formatter. Now, how do we actually get a string out of it? Well, what we can do is we can say self.formatter. We could actually go ahead and use the view controller since we made it static. So if you take a look back up here, we made it a static instance. So here we can go ahead and say the view controller, and autocomplete really doesn't want to help out right now. So view controller dot formatter, number formatter, I should say, and we want to get a string for a particular number. So there is this one here that takes in a NS number, which is perfectly okay. We'll go ahead and create a NS number with a particular floating point. So we can pass in a float here, a float literal, I should say. And what are we going to pass in? We're going to pass in the price that we've created right up above. And let's see if we get any errors or issues on this line. We probably need to convert this to a double, but then we also probably want to have a default value. So let's go ahead and do this like that. And let's see, let me actually go ahead and move this out onto a single line because it's getting a little long and a little messy. So let's try that again at the top here. So let's go ahead and delete this business here for just a moment. And what I'll first do is I'm going to say the formatter is going to be view controller dot number formatter. Looking pretty good. Then we're going to say the price string is going to be the formatter, and we want to go ahead and get a price for a given NS number. So we'll say NS number, and I believe we can pass in a value in here. So we can go ahead and open paren and pass in a value of price. And now that we've done that, this should go ahead and return to us a particular string, and we need an extra paren there to close that up. And let's see, so now this is going to give us a string back, so we can pass this price string in. So here we'll go ahead and say price string, and it's, keep in mind it's optional, as you can see in the autocomplete. So we can coalesce this and say NA maybe if we're not able to, get it. So now that we've got this here, let's see what else you want to do. We want to drop a return behind this instantiated object, and we should be hopefully good to go. So let's see what else we need. Looks like we don't need this extra paren there. That was unnecessary. Delete that and give it a run. And now we should start to see our prices properly show up. All right, look at that. We've got our prices. It actually brought in our currency as well, which is looking awesome. So now we also want to deal with the image. So this video's gotten a little longer than I wanted, but that's okay. So there is another endpoint, and it's a little silly that they give us the icon code down here in the API, but what we need is the icon itself. So there is a endpoint called icons, and we can go ahead and just drop it in right here. Actually, I believe it's assets/icons. All right. And this should give us back a array of icons, and we can also specify a size. So let's say we want an icon that's like 55 by 55. We'll get this array with the assets ID as well as the URL. So what we are going to do in our app is, as soon as the application launches, we are going to go ahead and fetch a list of all of these icons. And we'll basically hang on to that array, or dictionary, I should say. And whenever we want the URL for a particular asset, we can just hit this endpoint to get that image. So what I'll go ahead and do is we're going to jump back into our API caller, and we are going to write another function in here, which is going to be get all icons. It's going to have a completion handler in a moment here. But what I'll go ahead and first do is we're going to say guard let URL is going to be URL with a string. We'll go ahead and paste in our string. You can make this a constant if you want for sake of cleaning it up. We'll skip that for the sake of time. And we'll go ahead and return here, and I'm going to be lazy and copy the API call that we made up here, since it's basically exactly the same thing. The only thing that's going to be changing here is this completion handler we'll get rid of, and instead of decoding an array of cryptos, we're going to decode an array of icons. So in icons, we're going to want to have a respectable icon codable object here. So we'll jump into models, and we're going to want to create this here. So a icon per the response in the browser, I believe, had a asset ID, which was a string. Then I also had a URL, which was also a string. Make sure your casing is correct, otherwise you'll run into issues. And let's see, I think that should be good to go. So what do we actually want to do after we get these icons here? Well, we can actually hang on to them on self. So I'll go ahead and say self icon is going to be like that. Now we also want to make sure we capture weak self here, just like that. And if you think about it, we can just print out the error. We actually don't want a completion handler. What we want instead is going to be a array on this class that's going to hang on to those icons. I'll go ahead and say public var icons is going to be an array of icons just like that. And now we're good to go. Now, whenever our app launches, the very first thing that we probably want to do is hang on to our icons. So in app delegate, what we're going to do is we're going to fetch those icons by saying API caller shared, and we're going to say get all icons. We don't want a completion handler, so we can just go ahead and ignore it. But back in our API caller, we want to make sure that we only return the actual crypto assets after the icons have been fetched. So what I can go ahead and do is here I can say guard icons is not empty. Otherwise, what we want to do is we want to wait for the icons to be returned. So how do we actually wait for something? Well, we can just hold on to this this actual closure here. So I can go ahead and say private var when ready block is going to be of this type. So what I'll go ahead and do here is if the icons is empty, what we'll say is the when ready block is going to be the completion handler. and then we'll go ahead and return. And we already know that the app delegate would have called this function here. So what we can actually go ahead and do is we can once again call the getAllCryptos function once it's ready, and we can pass in the completion here. But where do we actually get this from? Well, it's going to be completion will be self is the get ready, or rather when ready block here. So once we get our icons back, and once we have that completion handler, we can go ahead and unwrap it, and we can go ahead and pass it in. Now let's see what's going on. Cannot find completion. Let's see, because we want to say if let here, since we're binding it with a space, of course. And now we should be in business. So now what do we actually accomplish by doing this? Well, let's run the app, and what you'll notice is everything looks exactly the same. But what we can now do is in our view controller, we can extend our view model to accept the URL for the particular row that we're creating. So what I'll go ahead and do is we're going to jump back to our view controller here, and we are going to create another property here, and this is going to be the icon URL. Now, how do we actually get this? Well, it's going to be API caller shared. We're going to get all the icons, and we're going to filter where $0.assetID equals, instead of using $0 because we're in a closure already, I'll go ahead and say icon in, but we'll filter where icon.assetID equals $0.assetID. Now, this should give us a single icon URL, so we'll say first.url, and otherwise we'll go ahead and coalesce it to a empty string like that. And this whole thing gives us a string back, so we'll go ahead and actually wrap it inside of a URL initializer. Now let me just go ahead and line break this so it's a little easier to read and understand, hopefully. All right, and now we'll extend our view model here to accept a icon URL. So I'll go ahead and say icon URL will be a optional icon URL. We'll jump to the definition of this view model here. So let's jump into there, and then we're going to create a let icon URL will be a URL optional. So now that we've actually passed in this URL, what we can do back in the view here is we can introduce a image view. So we're going to go ahead and say private let image view is going to be of type UI image view. We'll go ahead and create it in this block in here, UI image view. We're going to attempt to spell things correctly here. We'll go ahead and say the content mode is going to be scale aspect to fit. Now we want to go ahead and add this as a sub view as well. So we'll say add sub view. For our image view, we want to go ahead and lay it out. So let's go ahead and first calculate a image size. We can go ahead and say this is content view frame size height divided by maybe 1.1. And now we'll say that the frame of this, we can just copy and paste this perhaps, is going to be, let's see, we'll go ahead and say maybe this is 20 from the X. And we want to use this size here, this should be CG float, as the size of our image view. So we'll go ahead and do that. We don't want to divide it. Let's get rid of all that goodness. And let's see what else we want to do. We want the Y to account for the image size so it is vertically centered. So we'll go ahead and also tweak that there. Now, this is all size, so we can get rid of this size.width, as well as the height. And we'll change the Y. So the Y is going to be the entire height of the content view. We're going to take its height here, and we'll go ahead and subtract the size and divide it by 2. And now that we have an image on the left-hand side, we want the labels to take into account the size plus the buffer. So we'll go ahead and say 30 here plus size. This will be 30 plus size as well. And for the time being, let's set a background color to this image view. We'll go ahead and actually call this icon image view since it's yelling at us, since we can't use just image view. Go ahead and change that and that. But we'll set a background color is what I was saying here, because we want to actually make sure we're laying this out. And the next part, or the next step rather, I should say, we'll actually use the URL that we're passing in to go ahead and actually load in the image. So here it's yelling at us that we can't use $0. So here I'll say model in just to make it cleaner so it doesn't yell at me. This will be model. And let's see, this will also be model. $0 is just a fancy way to shorthand it, so you can just change it to an actual name. So once we have that, we can go ahead and run it. And let's make sure we're seeing our image view. All right, bear with my simulator. Hopefully it decides to actually load something, and if it doesn't, we'll need to take a look as to what is going on. So we might actually not be getting the API call going through. Ah, there it is. It's just super slow. Okay. So it's a little slow there, but we now have our image view, which is this red square showing up. We want to actually load in our image if the URL, points to one or exists, right? So we'll go back to our table view, and in our configure function, we actually have the URL now for the icons. We can say, if let URL is viewModel.icon URL. We can go ahead and create a fetch task to get the data from that URL with a completion handler. All right, now this is going to be data. We'll ignore that. We'll also ignore the error. And in here, we can say, if let data is data, we can go ahead and update on the main thread our image with the data. We want to make sure we capture weak self here so we don't have any issues. We'll say self.icon image view.image is going to be UI image with data, just like that. And we want to not forget to kick off this task here. And I'll do one more optimization here, which is you want to override prepare for reuse. And what this lets every single cell do is basically nil itself out in case, once it's ready to be reused for the next cell. So we'll go ahead and nil out the image here. We'll also go ahead and nil out the text of all the labels. So we'll say this is nil. We'll also do that for the price. And we'll also do that for the symbol. So go ahead and give this a run, and we should start to see our images actually come in. So it's a little slow because we're doing a really heavy API call, first for the icons, and then we're doing one for the actual symbols. So it's definitely on the slower side, but what that lets you do is load in these images super quick. Now, one thing you'll notice is some of these icons don't actually appear because they don't exist. But we want to get rid of this red background color. The other thing you'll notice, which is a problem, is if we scroll them off screen, then scroll back, it's a little fast, so it's kind of hard to see, but it's actually trying to download and fetch those again since we're not caching those images. So what we actually want to do is if we have fetched the image, we want to cache it. So let's take care of that stuff one by one, then I promise we'll wrap up this extremely long video. So we'll get rid of the red color there. Let's also go ahead and filter out, rather sort, our entries here to actually have things that have prices. So what I'll go ahead and do back in my controller is we can sort the view models, or maybe we can actually even sort the models. So if we jump to this API caller function, before we return the models, what I'll go ahead and do is we can actually sort them. So let's go ahead and say cryptos sorted by, and this is going to return an array of cryptos. And we can go ahead and say first and second here, and we can say return first dot price, which is going to be float optional, so we'll coalesce it to 0. If it's greater than second dot price, and we'll coalesce that to 0 as well. And we can actually take this whole expression and drop it into the success case here. And this will sort it, I believe, greatest price at the top to the lowest. So we'll see what we actually end up getting. Bear with the slow API call here. It's actually because we're getting a ton of data back that it's actually this slow. We could probably improve this later on, but cool. Now we've got W Bitcoin at the top, whatever the W stands for. And there's Maker up there, Ethereum, of course, and now we've got more logos as well. So you can see as we scroll, it's downloading those icons. And we'll also, if we scroll back up, you see it downloads them again, and it actually doesn't look too great. It's like jumping around at this point because they're queuing up. So what we want to actually go ahead and do is the last thing is we're going to extend our view model to allow for caching. So just to make it simpler, I'll go ahead and make this a class. And we're also going to add a icon data on here, which will be of type data optional. And we'll need to go ahead and create a initializer on here. So I'll go ahead and say init. And what do we actually want to pass in? Well, of course, we definitely want a name. We definitely want a symbol. We also definitely want a price, and the order here does matter, so just make sure you add it in the correct order. And then we also want this URL here. Now in here we can say self.name is going to be name, self.symbol will be symbol, self.price is going to be price, and finally self.icon URL will be icon URL. And now that we've done this, what it allows us to do is down here, once we've actually downloaded the image in the configure function, we can actually set it on the view model. So I can actually say view model dot icon data is going to be data. Now classes are reference types, so it'll actually persist it. And the next time we call this function, if the user scrolls back up, we can say if let data equals view model dot icon data. We can just use the cached data. Let's try that one more time. Icon data, we can use that. Otherwise, in the else case, we'll try to fetch the image. So what are we doing here? We're going to say icon image view dot image will be UI image data data. So looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and give this one final run, and let's see how things are looking. All right, bear with me here. It's going to be a little slower. You can go ahead and extend it and add a spinner in the middle if you so choose to do so, but we won't do that today since it's fairly easy in general. But let's wait for our data, and we get all of our stuff coming in. All of our icons have loaded. Now the ones that don't have icons, we can't do much about that, but when we scroll down and then back up, you'll notice that all of these icons persist and they don't actually download again or jump around or look kind of odd. So that's the beauty of caching, and it's fairly critical in most applications. So you can actually pretty clearly tell that it's caching. So there you have it. Let's also hit Command-Shift-A, and I'll take a look at this in light mode. The green color is a little questionable here. It's a little hard to read, but there is a pretty decent crypto price tracking app. Now, what I'll also say is, as a challenge and a bonus, if you want to do this and share it with me, maybe I'll shout you out in a video on this channel. This API has a lot of endpoints. You can actually build a pretty real-time, like a Robinhood style application where you can see, the graphs and the hourly and the daily, and there's tons of exchanges and symbols on here. So, extend it, make the app a little more versatile, and definitely share it with me. Either shoot me a message on LinkedIn or DM me on Instagram, whatever works for you. I'd love to see what you guys put together. But that is all I've got for you guys today. If you haven't smashed the like button already, don't forget to do so. Hit subscribe while you're at it so we can keep growing this channel together. The growth has definitely picked up, and I super appreciate it. And comment down below if you have any questions. One thing I know people might ask is, why didn't we use auto layout? Honestly, it's subjective. You could use auto layout or frame-based layout. Both are perfectly fine. And other than that, I will see you guys in the next video.